did I forget anything, Rob? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Without further ado, that's enough of me. Handing over to Jason, who's going to talk about... I'll let him introduce it. I'll get it wrong again. Thanks, guys.
Will you put that on the mic?
So how y'all doing? My name is Jason Wilkerson. I work at RBA Consulting over in the United States in Minnesota. And I flew all the way over here for this, believe it or not. Mike talked me into it. We got to chatting on Twitter and he dared me, so here I am. So I'm going to be talking about IoT, event hubs, and how we can integrate that with XDB. So, customer profile. This is really kind of the ultimate thing that we're really after as we use Sitecore really as a marketing platform rather than just as a CMS. We really are interested in getting to know everything we can about our customer, what activities they take online, information about them, and things like that. And it's really not necessarily so that we can, market our products and services to them, but it's really so that we can deliver relevant content when it's to deliver the right content to the right person at the right time. So the experience profile gets us started on that in a good way. We've got ways to see page views for users, see what they're doing. If you're actually tagging your content with profile keys and profiles and things like that, you can start to get an idea about the profile of that user. And you got among other things, you can see actions they're taking online, what events they've triggered, goals that they've triggered, campaigns that they've entered by, things like that. So it's a great place to start. But the one downside I would say to the experience profile currently is it's all online. Everything that is capturing data about online interactions with your user, whether some sort of online channel. That's what it's capturing. So what if we could go beyond that? What if we could try to capture data that's not just from some sort of online channel, but if we could capture some of those offline activities? And the IoT the Internet of Things is a great way to do that. So, if you don't know what IoT is, Internet of Things, it's a word that's been around for a concept that's been around for a number of years already. But the last year, 2 years or so, it's really taken on a lot of steam. So it's a way for us to network a lot of physical devices with sensors and things like that. Network all those together, capture that data, do something with that data. So that's the Internet of Things. So my inspiration for this talk was a little project we did. This is the lake right outside my office up in Minnesota. Yes, that lake is frozen. As a group, we built an ice house. So that we constructed this ice house to, it's 10% about fishing, it's 90% about drinking. But so we built an ice house. But as a technology company, of course, we didn't just build the ice house. We connected it to the internet. So we've got a little IoT device in there that there's a sensor where you could see where the door opens. If you caught a fish, you could hit a little doorbell and it would send out a tweet saying that you caught a fish. It wouldn't say how big the fish was, but it'd say you got one. You could control the thermostat, so if you knew you were going out there, you could turn the heat on remotely, things like that. So naturally, as a Sitecore developer, I thought, this is such a good idea. How can I Sitecore this? How can I take this idea and integrate it somehow with Sitecore? So I got to work. First thing I did is I tried to think of the scenario. What am I gonna, what kind of offline activities am I going to capture? And then what am I going to do with that that's an actual real life scenario, something that might actually work? So my first idea was some sort of retail location. So you walk into some retailer and you have some app on your phone, and there's beacons set up throughout the store so that it knows where you are. But I thought that was a little creepy. So I wanted to come up with something that didn't have that creepy factor. So I came up with sports. I'm not that big of an athlete, but I did just get into cycling recently and enjoy doing that. I've got the watch that tracks all the measurements that show that I really suck at it. But I decided this is sort of a more compelling scenario. So this is something where a user would actually opt into a service. They would use some sort of device that would capture this data, and then it could send it up to the cloud somewhere or something like that. So I thought this was a more appropriate scenario. So the pieces of the solution, that's kind of what came next, is what all do I need to do to make this work, to make this real life? So I started out with an IoT device. I got a couple of them just in case I burned one up, but I got a Raspberry Pi, and then I take the data that comes from that Pi and I send it up to a notification hub in the cloud. And I do that so that I can just let the device send the data, kind of fire and forget. So it's not worried about whether the communication was successful, it's not worried about something being down, it just fires the message off to the cloud and is done with it. So I fire it up to this notification hub, and then I've also got another thing, a listener in the background running somewhere that's listening at this notification hub location. It's looking for messages that are coming in and processes that message. So when it sees one come in, it determines where it came from, what kind of data it's got in it, and it parses that and then sends it down to Sitecore through, I use Sitecore entity service through the Sitecore services client to populate that data into the XDB. So getting started. Now that I've got kind of the three pieces of my solution, now what do? So the first thing I had to do is buy a hardware device and then figure out what the hell to do with it. Because I'm not a hardware guy, I'm a software guy. So I didn't know what jumpers were, I didn't know what pins were, you know, the input-output pins, and all that kind of stuff. I had to learn all that. So after an embarrassingly long time, I actually got my first little project going. So I wired up just a little button with a light and turned it on and off. Yeah, it was terribly exciting. But now that I have completely conquered the hardware world, I decided to move on. And moved on to the notification hub piece. So I decided to use Azure for this. So there's two ways you can do it in Azure. You can create an event hub. Event hubs are the service that's been around for a little while now. You can send messages up to the cloud. But that was, because it's been around for a while, it was really designed for device to cloud interaction only. So sending data from my device up to the cloud is really what it was meant for. IoT Hub, on the other hand, is something that's newer, and it was really built out for bidirectional communication. So sending data from my device to the cloud, but also being able to send data from the cloud to my device. And for instance, that's how we control things in the ice house, to turn on the heat, turn off the heat when you forgot, that kind of thing. So it really enables that bidirectional communication. So I chose to use the IoT Hub. And then onto the Sitecore side, I did a few things. I created some profiles and pattern cards so that I could, once I got that data from the cloud, I could do something with it. So I created some profiles and pattern cards. I extended the XDB Contact so I could store that data somewhere. And then I created the new entity service to do something with that data, so I could actually get it into XDB. So these were the profile cards that I set up. I set up a sport profile with 3 profile keys: cycling, running, and swimming. And then I created pattern cards for each of those. But I also created a couple more, the duathlete and the triathlete, so that it's kind of demonstrating some of the more, where it's interpreting from interactions that you have when you're not just statically what you've defined it. So those are the pattern cards and profile that I created. Next was extending the XDB Contact. So if you haven't done this yet, it's pretty easy, especially when you find the right blog post. But it's pretty easy to do. First thing I did was define the actual piece of data that's going to store the piece of the puzzle that's going to store the data. So I created the iDevice data element interface and created an implementation of that. But really, it's just a POCO. It's just storing some basic values there. Next was I created the actual facet itself. So this facet is what stores. It stores a collection of those iDevice data element objects. So that's the actual facet itself. And then the last part was just wiring it up to the patching and the configuration. So right here you see that I'm specifying the two new elements that I created. I created the iDevice data element and the iDevice data facet and specify their implementation. But then the last piece is actually adding that facet and giving it a name into the facets collection on the contact. The next piece was creating the entity service. If you're not familiar with entity service, it's something new that was introduced in Sitecore 7.5. There's two parts to the Sitecore services client. There's the item service and the entity service. And the entity service I found was a pretty neat idea, since you can create your own model objects, create your own custom business objects, and then you have this ready-made pretty much REST API waiting there for you to just implement it. So I created my custom business object, and then there's three parts to creating that entity service. There's create the model itself, so that's your custom business object. Create the repository so that it knows what to do with all those CRUD operations for that. And then that repository gets injected into the controller, and the controller is the actual API method, or the API side of it for the web API call. And one important piece that I have forgotten to mention in both of the sessions that I've done this in so far is, out of the box, the item web API and the item service are not session aware. So based on another really smart blog post that I Googled, I found a way to make that session aware. So you can actually have access to the tracker inside this controller method. So I started off with the, kind of like on the facet side, I started off by creating the model itself. So in order for it to be considered a model for use with the entity service, you have to inherit from entity identity. And, but apart from that, it's just all the properties that I'm storing pieces of data in. Next was creating the repository. So implement the iRepository interface for your custom business object. That will, when you implement that interface, it'll give you, I think, 5 or 6 methods. It's essentially all the CRUD operations: add, update, delete, fetch, things like that. In my case, all I needed to do was implement the exists, which just returned false because I'm just always sending in new data, and then the add, implement the add method. So in this method, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the current tracker, the current contact from the tracker. I'm getting my facet, and I'm creating a new instance of that facet, and then I just populate everything with the data that came in from my new business object. The next part is the controller. So this is the actual API controller. In order to wire this up, and if all you're doing is adding, update, delete, and whatever, specifying the functionality within the repository, all you need to do is inherit from entity service of your new custom type, and it will put in the controllers for you, the controller with the repository injected. I overrode create entity. I'll show you that in a second, because I'm actually doing something with that data after it's getting added to the contact object. But really, all you need to do is specify these two controllers, and you're good to go. So the piece that I did in the back in this override of the create entity method is this is where I'm actually adding that data and adding in interaction to the contact record. So I've got some keys up there, so I go grab my profile for my new sport profile that I created, and based on the type of device data that was sent in, whether it's cycling, running, or swimming, I just add, I score that profile with one of those keys. So in my case, the value of those profile keys was just 0 or 1. So I'm just sending in the value 1 for that. And then once I get through all this, I add that new score to this to the profile, and then update the pattern. And in this case, since it's just a web API interaction, and I'm not, this isn't a user session that's going to continue, I go ahead and abandon the session so that all of that data that's in memory gets flushed down to Mongo. So I did do my IoT device with the button and stuff, and I was going to move on to actually doing, trying to capture some of this data from my bike, but I decided that it would be better to simulate it. So unfortunately, I figured that if I tried to go through airport security with something like that, I might get hassled a little bit. So I decided to I decided just to whip up a little WPF app. It's doing all the same things that we're talking about in that solution. It's just not receiving the data from the physical device. So now it's demo time. So let me fire up my little IoT simulator.
Just checking. Just checking that you know that we can't see it. That's all.
Yeah, it's still. Yeah, it takes a minute because it's actually registering the listener with Azure. So I didn't spend a lot of time making this thing look perfect, but so basically what I've got here is I've got 3 sections up at the top, one for sending cycling data, one for sending running data, one for sending swimming data. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see a window. This is the window about the message going to Azure. So you'll see that we'll see, when we click one of these buttons, it'll package up that data that we're specifying. It'll create it as a JSON object, and it'll send it. And then this side of the window is that listener that I was talking about. So the stuff that's going to come in here is the stuff it's listening to that notification hub, and when it sees a message come in, it'll process that message, and it'll actually open up that JSON object, present the data here just so you can see that they're the same, and then you'll see that it sends it to Sitecore. So now, just so I can see what I'm showing you. Duplicate that. See that fine? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with sending some, pretend somebody went swimming, and I've got a user here that I've already registered with my web application. So I'm going to specify that, and I am using the email address as the contact identifier in XDB. So I'm going to, let's say they swam a mile, and I'm going to send that data. And as we can see over on the left-hand side, we've got our identifier specified, the sport that they're doing, the activity that they're doing, the distance that was sent, I'm not using these other two properties for this particular one, but we see it all got packaged up. It was sent up to Azure, and then over on the right-hand side, Azure says we got a message received. It unpacked that message, all of that JSON, and you can see it's the same data. It sent that data to Sitecore, and then it sent that data to Sitecore. So let me show you what I'm actually doing with it. So I am using Habitat mainly because I wanted to actually play with it.
Getting fancy.
I am getting fancy. So I added a feature to Habitat. Getting really fancy now. So I added a feature, my little IoT feature. So what I'm going to show you, I haven't logged in with that user that I sent the data for yet. But what I built is just this simple little content component with an image, a title, and some garbage text. This is the default content. So I set up some personalization rules based on that XDB Contact card, and when it matches the proper pattern, I change it out to a different content item. So this is the default item. So now, if I go log in with my test account, I'll give you one guess at what the password is. So now we can see that we've swapped out that default content with something that was about that XDB Contact, about the data that we sent in. So now I'm going to send another piece of data about a different user. Let's say they ran 10 miles and they did it really quick. I don't know, something like that. I'm going to send that data. It's going to send that off to Azure, assuming I'm still connected. Okay, it's sent. This is much slower than it normally is. Is this where you do the Jeopardy theme song? Okay, well that should come in any minute now. So when that comes in, because we did sent some running data, if we log in as that user, it will show, just like we swapped it out for some swimming data, it'll show some running information. You know what, let me fire this back up. The last time this wasn't a problem. So let me try this again. You know what, before I go tempt fate, I'm just going to move on to my third and final piece of the demo. I'm going to choose another user. And I'm going to send information about all three sports. So hopefully this goes through. So we got one. Again. So I sent some cycling data, some running data, and now finally some swimming data. And it was all successfully sent to Sitecore. So let me fire back up Habitat. And log in as that user. And again, because I only sent data about those three individual sports, but now that I'm logged in as that user, I'll go to my feature and we'll see that it's matched on that triathlete pattern card because I had scored the user on all three of those individual profile keys. So if we go back to the presentation real quick. So you got it?
Yep.
So what are some of the next steps? So now that we've kind of taken that small step of creating all these pieces of the solution, and we're showing that we've got the data flowing all the way through, what are the next steps? Well, it's really use your imagination. The whole point of this wasn't to show an actual hugely compelling business case that needed to be solved or anything like that. It was really just to get your mind going, kind of give you, spark the creativity and think about what you can do with this. So it's really up to you, how far you want to take it. So that's the end of the demo and talk. Questions?
How do you swim with the device?
Well, since I didn't actually build it, I didn't have to worry about that use case. The question was, how do I swim with the device? And because I'm not a swimmer, again, it was a demo, not an actual scenario. But any other questions? So here's just some references to the blog posts that I used to create this. So one was a shout out to Mike Robbins for the entity service piece of it, tracking the untrackable. That's the part about making the entity service session aware, and then extending the XDB Contact with Nick Wesselman from Active Commerce. So you can contact me if you have any other questions that come up. After this, feel free to hit me up on Slack or Twitter. They both use the same handle, or my blog at citizensitecore.com. Thank you very much.